Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toops. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. As always, if you're on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. It really helps grow the podcast. If you're on any audio player, leave a 5-star review. And no matter how you listen, please share it with your friends, your coworkers, your colleagues, anyone who's really interested in software engineering or becoming a software engineer. It really helps grow the podcast. And Nathan, we're excited for this episode today. Like we said, this is our end of the year content, and so we're doing a couple wrap up episodes, taking a break from reading the best technical books in the world and just talking about some of the technical books we've read. And this week we are going to do our top 5 books that we ranked them for the year. Nathan, what are your thoughts on this episode?
Yeah, so we thought there was gonna be a bunch of overlap and all this other fun, crazy stuff, and I'm surprised that we had so little overlap. So
Absolutely.
I still don't actually know what Carter picked, other than the
And
one.
I don't know what you picked either. It was
Yeah.
funny. We we had this whole system like, okay, we'll pick our top 5, and then number 1 is worth 5 points, and then number 5 is worth 1 point, and we both emailed them to my wife, and then she compiled and like, this will yield the top 5, and she's just like, what happens if none of you chose the same books? And so we chose one book that we know there's an overlap there. So we're going to talk about that one first, and then we'll just go bottom up from 5 to 1. And so we can't give you a definitive Book Overflow top 5, but we can give you our individual top 5s and why we like them. So I guess let's just start with the one we have in common, which I guess if you're going by that scoring system, this is the definitive number 1 book, but I don't think we're actually keeping points. And that was Fundamentals of Software Architecture by Mark Richards and Neal Ford. I had this ranked as number 2, and Nathan, you had it ranked as number 4, I believe.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah. So why don't you go first, Nathan? Tell us why you ranked this, and maybe why you felt it secured number 4, but not numbers 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah. So this was tricky. I loved. Actually, there wasn't. I think we've talked about this before. There wasn't a bad book that we read. There wasn't one I regretted, or I was like, oh, we shouldn't have made an episode about that. So picking your top 5 out of the 15 or so books that we've read so far was not easy. And so I think that there's probably, depending on which time of day and which day of the week I would have actually made this top 5 pick, I think this list would have been pretty volatile. Like, I may have come to a different conclusion, after lunch or whatever. But it made top 5, and it made number 4 because, number 1, I'm very interested in the architecture style books. You could probably guess that there's other architecture books in my list. It made it further down though because while I'm a big fan of it, it didn't surprise me and delight me in ways that a couple of the other books have. And so that's why it made number 4. Again, depending on the time of day, I probably could have put it up to number 3 or 2, something like that. But this one's a solid one. I think this is one of those books that I would recommend to everybody. I think Fundamentals of Software Architecture, especially if you are moving up in your career, if you really if you want to understand the bigger patterns, it's very important. And the way that they lay the book out is very approachable. You don't have to be an advanced software architect to read this. It's a fundamentals book, right? So someone who's a product manager could take a lot from this, a CEO of a small startup, somebody who's just doing, maybe staff level software engineer who really kind of wants to get into these more abstract problem domain. Yeah, it's an amazing book.
Yeah, your reasons are there's a lot of overlap with my reasons. I ranked it as number 2, and we can kind of, as we talk about the rest of our list, we'll get a little more context around it. But for me, it's a lot of the same stuff. This book is comprehensive but digestible. I think it starts out, it's divided into 3 parts, and I just think each of the parts is fantastic. The first part kind of talks about okay, what are all the characteristics of creating software architecture, right? It's really cool just to define things like reliability, scalability, security, things like that. Then the second section, which I love, is just an overview of a dozen common architecture patterns, right? And it's really nice to start to classify some of those patterns. And I think it helps when you know some of those patterns, either when you come in and work in an established system to identify pretty quickly, like, okay, we're using this pattern, or when you're building your own system to not fall into, as they call it, the big ball of mud. Just having a little clear vision, I think, is really helpful. And then the third section is under discussed and I think underappreciated, which is all about kind of selling your architectural vision. Right. There's a lot of concrete advice on like giving presentations, on working with others, negotiation skills. It's just like you said, like this is the kind of book where like I would recommend to pretty much anyone. Like I would recommend this to like someone fresh out of school. A lot of it's going to go over your head, but I think I just remember being in my first job and hearing my more senior coworkers kind of discuss architectural stuff and just being totally lost. Like I didn't even know how you would begin to approach those things. So I think this is a great book for pretty much anyone. That's why it cracked my number 2. When we get to my number 1, I'll kind of talk about maybe why I ranked it above it. But yeah, fantastic book. And I think the fact that it made both of our lists speaks to its general purpose nature for software engineers. So please, if you haven't read it yet, we would highly recommend that one. Fundamentals of Software Architecture by Mark Richards and Neal Ford. And that is, we have interviews with both of them, Mark Richards and Neal Ford. So that's also what makes the book extra special to us. So that's the only thing we had in common.
I'm so shocked. I mean, this is, I'm really like leaning forward, being like, what is on your list? And how did I not reach the same conclusions? This is going to be very interesting.
I often say that I think the essence of this podcast is when we talk about the kind of music we like to listen to. And we like, other normal music. But you mentioned that you really like chip tunes.
Yeah.
So you really like to listen to like pop songs, but rendered on a Game Boy.
No, there'll be like original weird songs.
Oh, so like original weird songs.
Yeah, but they're like 8-bit or 16-bit.
Yeah. So you see like original songs rendered on like 8-bit stuff. And I'm the total opposite. I love 8-bit songs rendered by like big band orchestras.
That's amazing. So there's the 8-bit overlap, which I guess is the real geekery piece, but then there's just like the personal tastes, and that's where we differentiate. Yeah, that's great.
So I think that's I like that about this podcast is obviously we have a lot of overlap as software engineers and we get along well, but I do find that we I joke, I have another friend, Nathan, he's just wrapping up his PhD, but we say we are the yin and yang of Taco Bell because we love Taco Bell. And I think our menu preferences, there's no overlap. It's like if he likes an item, then I hate that item, but we still both love Taco Bell. So between the two of us, we cover 100%
I have to know what is an item that this other Nathan really likes from Taco Bell that you don't like?
So I don't love anything with the flatbread. Like the 3-cheese chicken flatbread is one where
my experience of Taco Bell is so aged at this point. I don't think I've had Taco Bell in probably 15 years. And so I remember when I was a college student though, Taco Bell was amazing because it was cheap. And this is going to date myself. You could get a fresco style bean burrito, which is one of the things that I would get all the time for like 79 cents.
Yeah.
Back in my day. But I would order just like 2 bean burritos because I was like, okay, for like $1.50 and and some change, I could like eat a meal with enough calories to get me through.
So. I know it's more expensive these days. I love it so much though. I had it for lunch and dinner the other day. I am on a first name basis with the Taco Bell manager.
That's amazing.
I love it. Well, this is not a Taco Bell podcast as much as I might like it to be. So let's just go bottom up, starting with number 5. Nathan, because I'm curious. I don't know what your top 5 are. You don't know what mine are. So why don't you tell me, Nathan, what is, now that we know that there's no overlap, what is your number 5 list or entry?
Yeah, so number 5 is actually building evolutionary architectures. So
interesting.
So fundamentals came in at number 4 for me. Number 5 was building evolutionary architectures, and I put it there because I thought of this as a really nice expansion on. You needed to have the fundamentals down before you really get what you can out of evolutionary architectures. But as someone who's deeply interested in the architecture side, this was a really great manual for like diving in on having um, stuff that can change over time and building things in a way that can change over time, which is in every startup I've ever been in, and even in the bigger companies, you need to have a good grasp of this. Otherwise, you will, you'll be sad. So yeah, I really like this one. I thought the title was cool, but I didn't realize how much I would love. I think I'm also biased because like we interviewed almost all the authors, and there's a bunch on this book.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And those conversations just like deepened my enjoyment of this book even more. I would highly recommend reading this book on your own, then watching our episode about it, and then listening to the authors talk about it. Because like, if you really want to go deep, like we actually have that content now, and you should check it out.
This is famously the book that broke the podcast because we we were trying to read it all in 1 week, and it is such a dense book. I think maybe the reason it didn't make my list is I'm not as much in like I've mentioned I'm on a team with 20 engineers, which like is insane, and it shouldn't be that big. But with that, there's a lot of like consensus making, and I don't necessarily have the ability to just say, hey, we're redoing this key part of the architecture, right? And so I didn't find this book as applicable. Like I have a lot of authority on my team. It's nice. It's a little, even though I work at a big company, just because we make internal tooling, it's a little more startup-y. And so I have a lot of authority. Like the other day, I just figured out the way we're doing our configs kind of results in circular dependencies. I'm like, I'm going to extract these configs out to their own package, and then, that'll kind of solve all that. And it's really appreciated on the team. People be like, oh my gosh, thank you for doing that. But I couldn't say like, good news, everyone, we're switching from this paradigm to this paradigm.
Right.
So
we're going to start using QLang. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So I think for me, I enjoyed it. It didn't quite resonate with me at this stage of my career, but that's one I'm absolutely going to come back to, especially if I find myself kind of like in your position where you've been at some smaller companies, but you are like the software architect or the CTO. Like that is absolutely one that will resurface in my career.
So do we want to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Do we want to go 5 to 1 per person, or do you?
Yeah, 5 to 1 per person, I think.
Okay, cool.
Let's bounce back and forth. So I can do my 5. So my 5 was What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work by Stephen Wolfram. I really enjoyed this one. I've talked about on this podcast, one of my favorite things about doing this podcast is gaining a deeper appreciation for how the tools I'm using actually work. Large language models have, I won't say upended, but they are the biggest development in software engineering tooling since, I don't know, what would you say, Nathan? At least containerization?
Yeah, it's hard to differentiate the hype cycle from the actual innovation.
Absolutely.
But I like to I've talked about this actually yesterday with a guy who's started using Cursor at work.
Oh yeah,
and
I'm a big
I was
Cursor
like,
fan.
Everyone gets an intern. That's what I say it is. I was like,
Yeah,
it's about the reliability. I was like, you have a really knowledgeable liar who will, make up a solution that might work and might not. And so you kind of have to learn how to be a little bit of a manager. And you go, okay, I'm going to rein you in a little bit. But it's amazing, and it will actually tie into some of the stuff that we talk about later. But yeah, I think it's one of those moments where it's kind of like when the iPhone came out, and it became obvious that like capacitive touchscreen phones where you have the internet in your pocket became so obvious after it happened, but nobody knew quite what to do before. I think having these large language models helping us with the minutia of part of our job that we thought it was just our job, and then realizing that like, no, actually what's invaluable about my job is much more abstract. It's the stuff that the large language model can't do, right?
I definitely find it a time saver. I'm a big Cursor user, and especially anything with like CSS. Like I'm not a gifted CSS wizard. And so I had a problem the other day where I was just like, hey, like these two, I was trying to add like a tooltip to the menu heading in a column, and like the tooltip was appearing on a separate line, and it looked real janky. I just asked Cursor. I even gave it a picture. I'm like, it's doing this. Like, what's going on? It's like, oh, you should just restructure the CSS like this. And like, it was fantastic. But cool. I've also had it plenty of times, like with stuff that's a little more like business logic-y. where it's just totally out in left field and I have to rewrite it myself. But I think even as I construct my prompts, like for Cursor, ChatGPT, or whatever LLM I'm using, reading this book has helped me, I think, construct better prompts. I think it has also given me a bit more security that like no AI isn't coming to take all of our jobs. That was one of our takeaways I remember from our episode is like LLMs are fundamentally unintelligent. They're not reasoning. They're
Right.
just spitting out, it's an amazing like act of mimicry, right?
Yeah. Sam Altman is over. It's my hot take. Sam
Yeah.
Altman is just completely wrong that we're on the cusp of AGI. At least
Yeah.
we're not on the cusp of AGI with large language models as we think of them. Now, is there some orchestration of a bunch of tools that make it indistinguishable from, human intelligence? That's to be said, but large language models themselves aren't they're not creative forces in the way that human intelligence is. I think they're just
Yeah.
fundamentally different.
I feel kind of the same way. I kind of feel the same way about large language models as like the original like Alexa and Google Home and Siri, that like if you don't understand how these technologies work underneath the surface, you might think that current LLMs are a natural evolution from that original technology. But they're not. Like they are just completely different in how they operate. And I'm not saying that AGI is impossible. It very well could be possible, but I don't think large language models are your ticket to it. I think if we get there, it's going to be kind of like how we had to throw out everything we knew in natural language processing with
Right.
the smart home speakers to get to LLMs. So yeah, just a great book. And also, again, a soft spot in my heart because we were able to interview Stephen Wolfram. He was, I think, probably the hardest person to coordinate with, which like I'm not blaming Steven. I think it's absolutely crazy that we were even able to talk to him, but I worked pretty hard to to set that up. And so that's
Yeah.
another reason it winds up my list, just because how cool. Nathan, did you think when we started this podcast that within the first 6 months we'd interview Stephen Wolfram?
No.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, if I was ranking like top 5 interviews, he would have definitely made it to
Yes.
that.
Yeah. Fascinating
This
fellow.
didn't this didn't make my list. Again, this was like the hard parts about the hard parts kind of thing. It's like I had to cut stuff.
Yes.
There's several books that surprised me that didn't make my final list.
Mhm.
And I have a feeling that's what actually ended up making the chopping block is probably more overlap with what you have on your side.
I told my wife that I was like, it doesn't surprise me that our top 5. I guess it surprised me a little that our top 5 is pretty different, but I bet our top 10 is like 9 out of 10
Yeah,
similar.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think so
Um,
too. I think so too.
well then, why don't we move on to what was your number 4, Nathan? I'm curious.
Yeah, so
No,
my
that was
number
fundamentals.
that was fundamental. So my
Okay,
number 4 was fundamental software architecture. So my bottom 2, right? So 4, 5 were the
the
architecture related books. So
our Neal Ford books. So I guess I'll share my number 4 then. Clean Coder by Bob Martin.
yeah.
Um, Now, this is one where it cracked my top 5, not even necessarily because of the content in it, although I think, like most Bob Martin books or opinions, take them with a grain of salt. This is just a really breezy read. Like, it is a ton of stories. It was cool to get, like, the personal view. Uncle Bob is famously very opinionated about code, but to kind of get, like, the background on him personally and professionally and kind of maybe what led him to be so opinionated, I found fun. I read this entire thing in like 2 hours on an airplane. um I love a good story. I say my number one complaint about my job as a software engineer is that I do not get enough stories out of it.
Right.
um that's why I share stories on the podcast because we're talking to software engineers, but like I was a missionary for my church in Brazil years ago. But my favorite thing about that was that I was meeting and talking to new people every day, and every day kind of brought like a new story. Um, so I love a good story, and so hearing all of Uncle Bob's stories really um, was a treat for me. Super easy read, and I think it'll just introduce some new ideas about what it means to be a professional. And again, like I would be concerned if you read this book and took it as the gospel truth. But our kind of goal when doing Book Overflow was when people ask me kind of like, what's your vision for how the podcast is going to sound? Like what kind of, what's the vibe? I would say I want it to sound like two coworkers talking over lunch.
Right.
And hopefully our listeners feel like they're just eavesdropping on what we hope are good conversations. Clean Coder very much has that feel. Like just hearing someone, monologue about their career, but someone who's had an interesting career and someone who has good stories. And I'll say that about Uncle Bob. Interviewing him, he is one of the most charismatic authors we have interviewed. And you can see why he's had such a successful career in consulting. He has a force of a personality. Again, very strong opinions. We do not sign off on everything Uncle Bob has ever said. But it was cool getting to know him on a bit more of a personal level. And he's a very good storyteller. So if you're looking, I think out of all the books we've read, if you've heard us discuss stuff like building evolutionary architectures or fundamental software architecture, it's like, oh, that's interesting, but kind of heady. If you're looking for like a good lighter read, Clean Coder is one I would recommend. So that's why I cracked my top 5.
Yeah, and I totally get that. The reason it's funny, the reason it didn't crack mine is that I think if I look at my top 5 here, they are a little more ivory tower. I think maybe this is also just exposing what I've been focused on recently, because I'm from a very similar background as Uncle Bob, in that, like, I didn't go to some Ivy League school. I wasn't formally trained in this stuff. I just kind of got interested in it and kept going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I appreciate his perspective. And yeah, again, I don't agree with all the conclusions, but I think it's a solid book. I am not surprised it made your top 5. I think it's a very good book to make top 5.
Yeah,
I will say though, this is one though that I don't think there is a path in which I would have put it top 5 for me. So
yeah, and that's fair. This is definitely the dark horse candidate, I think, for like a top 5 list.
Yep.
But to me, when I think about it, I just can't disentangle that. Like, it was a breezy, fun read. Like, we have enjoyed every book we've read. But being perfectly honest, there have been some books, we record Wednesday morning usually. There have been some books I'm furiously reading Tuesday evening and kind of like cursing myself because I've put it off all week, right?
Right.
And I always appreciate the knowledge I get out of it. But there are some books where they're not exactly like, oh, I just can't wait to get back to that book. Clean Coder, very, very pleasant read. So that to me was worth cracking the top 5. Well, so that covers number 5 and 4 for us. Nathan, why don't you give us your number 3?
Number 3 is a little different, but I love this book. It's Unix, A History and a Memoir.
Oh, that's another one where, like, I think that I just barely kicked that out. Fantastic book.
Yeah, the reason I put it there is that I have been interested in Bell Labs particularly. I think I've even talked about it on here a bit. I've definitely talked about it on Functionally Imperative, which is I'm a huge fan of Claude Shannon. And even though Claude Shannon was not part of Unix, I think that the environment that Bell Labs cultivated, this sort of curiosity and creativity and finding exceptional people to work on these kind of problems, is something that allured me. And I didn't know a ton about Bell Labs. I just knew that they kept cranking out prolific ideas with amazing people that I've followed their careers, like people like Rob Pike, people like Russ Cox, who's like also worked on the Go programming language, and other folks that were just very interesting. I think this is I tried to decouple our interviews from our books recommendations as one of those things, but in this one I couldn't help it. Like talking to Brian Kernighan about you. Like, not only did we get to read this book, but we actually got to like dive in. This was like a fanboy moment. I think if I talk to anybody who is a Unix fan, anybody who likes the history of like Unix-like operating systems, this is a must read. It just gives you a glimpse into that world that you're just like, how did this all happen? This is amazing.
There is a fantastic, I think it's a full chapter in there, where he basically just gets down to brass tacks and like, okay, why was Unix revolutionary? And I love that chapter because like, and that's been a recurring theme in the podcast too, is realizing that there are ideas or opinions I hold about software engineering. But if you ask me to actually like really explain them, I realize like, I don't know how thoroughly I can explain this. Like if you ask me, Carter, was Unix a revolutionary, operating system? We're like, oh yeah, totally. And they say, well, why? I'm like, I have no idea. So that was really cool for me. I think it missed my top 5 because, and I'm even noticing now kind of subconsciously that a lot of mine are a little more, well, maybe not. I don't know. I think there's a bit more of like kind of career focus for me. And it's it's a history book. I mean, it's literally a history and a memoir. But it is absolutely fantastic. And I will say again, that is another breezy read. And I think we talked about on the podcast, like it feels like a Christmas book or something, like something you got to like read curled up next to the fire, sipping some hot cocoa. Oh, and also in terms of Bell Labs, you ever seen the TV show Severance on Apple TV?
No, it's been on my list. I think I started watching like the first episode, and I was just like, sometimes when you start a new show and you're like, I'm not in the mood to start a new show.
Yeah.
It's nothing against the show. I've had false starts with other shows I've loved. But tell me about it.
You've got to check it out. It's amazing, and you're in a good place to check it out because the second season releases like next month, but there's been a 3-year wait between seasons, and so it's one of my favorite shows I've ever seen. And I'm not really a guy who watches new shows. Like I'm very much like I will just rewatch 30 Rock until the day I die. And
cool.
So to see one is great. So it's a great show. Check it out, anyone, if you haven't seen it yet. But it's a show about a company and work, and the big main building they work in, I found out is a Bell Labs building, and like they
Cool.
shoot on set. And because I looked it up because I was reading that it was like part of Bell Labs. Like, wait, is this where Unix was invented? It's not. Unix was invented in a separate campus, but in Unix history and memoir, it's in Holmdel, New Jersey. This building, Brian does mention it a couple times, and I was like, oh, that's crazy.
One last little piece, and then we'll move to your number 3. We've been doing interviews with this company that I've joined, and one of the candidates actually was working at Nokia Bell Labs, which of course is a very different environment now. But Nokia now runs, I guess they purchased the Bell Labs piece, and so it was cool because he was doing he's a software engineer, but he actually has a background in doing like FPGA. That was his like PhD research, and I was like, okay. We just geeked out. We just geeked out on like completely irrelevant things. I was mostly interested in his curiosity and approach, which is the type of thing that we're hiring for this role. And it was so cool. It was so fun to just talk to him. And so, yeah.
Well, then I'll go ahead and share my number 3. Web Scalability for Startup Engineers by Artur Edgemont. I have always said, like, my origin story for kind of getting into software was having like a business idea that I thought could have been really cool, and then promptly realizing that I had absolutely zero idea how to make it, and I never wanted to be in that position again. Web Scalability for Startup Engineers, if you're talking about any sort of web product, I think is really cool because it's older. This is one we talked about. Like I would love a second edition of this, just to dive a little more into things like containerization and orchestration. But as far as like, I don't know, like it's just so cool to me to get like a full picture on like, how do you get something from an idea to the internet? And then how do you build it in such a way that it could serve millions of users? Scalability is just such a fascinating concept for me. And I just loved kind of, again, like you asked me, like, Carter, is it important to make a website scalable? I'm like, oh yeah, totally. And it's like, well, how do you do it? I could give you a lot of the basics. And in this book, I don't think anything in it really surprised me. Like, I know it's a big revelation for some people when you talk, like, when they first find out like load balancing and realizing that there's actually like 100 copies of the server that runs YouTube. And then it's all hidden behind a load balancer and things like that. That wasn't a new concept to me. But like when it got into like caching strategies, like I'm familiar with caching, all of the different kinds of caching strategies I hadn't heard of before. Do I remember any of them from the book? Not really. But the next time I need to implement sort of a big, scalable caching strategy, it'll absolutely be the first place I go and look. So really enjoyed it. This is one of the, we have not been able to interview Artur. It's not for lack of trying. If anyone here personally knows Artur Edgemont, I know that's a weird, probably shot in the dark. Hook us up because I really, really enjoyed this book. It cracked the top 3, and I'd love to talk to him more about it.
That's cool. This is a book that could have easily been on my top 5. It's a great book. It didn't, and again, I think where your headspace was and my headspace was is starting to make more sense. Like yours is a very like pragmatic and career focused one, and mine's like it's sort of like abstract and heady. And so I think we'll be even less surprised, I bet, when we get to the top one and top two. So,
I might surprise you. I might have a curveball coming your way.
oh,
We'll see.
good.
We'll see.
Good.
Well, so why don't you share my top two was fundamentals of software architecture, and we've kind of already talked about that. Tell me your top two, Nathan, or your number two.
My number two is the practice of programming.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this one is starting to show its age, right? There's some specific details in it that I don't think have that that we had the joke, which then this is one that was co-authored between Rob Pike and Brian Kernighan. It's actually what got Kernighan on the first time. If again, the longer I've been away from it, I kind of mentioned this, but I completely agree. It is a blueprint for how Go was created. So if you're a fan of Go, which again, I have a big gopher behind my my left shoulder, I guess. It just really sums up a lot of where Rob Pike's head was when he was like, this is what a good programming language that encourages good patterns are. I liked it because it brings these little truisms, these little proverbs, basically, that teach you a little lesson, and then gives you some examples on top of it. I think it's very practical if you're trying to write thoughtful code, right? And so I think that the proverbs have aged well. Maybe some of the specific examples, like there is no CSV parser or something, is not necessarily true anymore. But yeah, that's why it made it up there.
It's like you say, we have to decouple the interviews from the books when choosing, but this one will always have a soft spot in my heart. The origin of this one is funny because when we were first starting out the podcast, like we've said in the podcast before, Nathan and I have actually never met in person. We only met each other because we wanted to do this podcast together. And so we were just kind of trying to pick the first books. You recommended this one, Nathan, and I had already decided that I was going to agree to whatever you recommended because I wanted to. I wanted to be like a good co-host.
Throw me a bone.
I was like, if he wants to read it, like then absolutely. Like you could have recommended like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and I would have been like, that's a great idea, Nathan. And so we read this one, and I really enjoyed it. I think it didn't make my top 5 because it's very old at this point, and so I think you're right. Maybe mine are a little more pragmatic. This go around, but in terms of books that made the podcast, this was what got Brian Kernighan on the podcast. That was a big moment for us when he even responded to the email. And then Brian Kernighan's interview went viral on Hacker News. I think we got like up to number 2 on Hacker News. And that happened.
We had like 200 subscribers or something, right? I think it was
it was like 500 or something. Okay. So we had 200, and then we got like an additional 600 on YouTube from this interview alone.
Yeah, wow.
And there were lots of great positive comments on Hacker News, and for that happening early on the podcast, we'd still be doing this podcast even if that hadn't happened. But it was a good confirmation to us, like we might be onto something here. Like there's a demand for this content, a very niche demand, but a demand nonetheless. I think at my job, I over-indexed in the first couple months on kind of like ivory tower-ness and just trying to like, well, what's the best way to do it? And I think there's a lot of room for that. But I under-indexed on just getting my hands dirty and building stuff. And so lately I've had the chance I mentioned I was on a different team and then got called back to this team, just kind of help out on a few projects. And so I've been able to kind of redo it the way I kind of wish I'd done it and just get my hands dirty with a lot of stuff. And so that's where my headspace has been a little more at these past 6 weeks or so. So yeah, I'm not as much in like an ivory tower mood, but it's a great book. I think it's cool, like you said, like you are the one who had that realization, like that it's kind of like the seeds for Go are planted in there. And that's cool. That's cool to recognize stuff like that. So
that book had a special spot too because I had started it And it was a false start book. And so this also represents the fact that
That's
like
true.
we've committed to reading these books, and Book Overflow has been a fantastic catalyst for follow through. I think that's probably in both of our personalities where we were like, I don't know. Like I liked it, but I would have been busy and then something else would
Yeah,
have come
yeah.
up and I would have stopped. So
My
it was
my
nice.
my reach exceeds my grasp like crazy.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I mean, I'd go to say 70 to 80% of the books we've read here, I would not have finished if I didn't know if I didn't have the deadline of like we're recording and I have to be able to not I just finish this book, but talk about it for an hour to an hour and a half, which isn't a slight against the books. Like I think everyone who listens to this podcast, we get comments from our listeners all the time, which are like, wow, I really want to start reading more. Like we all want to read more, but it's tough. Like it's harder to read a dense technical book than it is to scroll Twitter.
Yep.
So this podcast is aspirational in a sense, and it's not a slight to any of the authors when I say like sometimes I had a hard time finishing that. Like I that's one of my like I think pet peeve isn't the right word, but I don't know. I think sometimes we'll talk about like things being hard and we'll say that it's like a bad thing. Like, I don't know. Most things that are worth doing are hard. And so like if I said this book was hard to finish, that's not necessarily a slight against the book. Like most things that are hard to do are worth, or most things that are worth doing are hard to do. There are plenty of things that are hard to do that aren't
Or
necessarily
not
worth doing.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, does that take us to number one?
Wait,
no, we have your number two.
I did my number two. I don't think you've done your number two.
Well, mine was some fundamentals of software architecture.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Right. So we can kind of breeze over that.
So this is number one. Okay, I'm shocked because I'm shocked that my number one didn't crack your list. So let me hear your number one, and then I'll share mine.
Right. I'm so curious. So mine was philosophy of software design.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic book.
Yeah. So again, super ivory tower, and I think this one gets to the most of ivory tower of the ivory towers. John Osterhout is again fantastic guest, but this is the one that I think it's in the same, like practice programming and philosophy of software design are similar in that they're a bunch of these sort of, I guess, almost like proverbs or principles, right? And then he elaborates on it. I think if I go between the Uncle Bob camp of writing code versus the John Osterhout camp, I aspire to be John Osterhout.
Yeah.
I want to write stuff that another programmer looks at and goes, this is beautiful code, right? This is so well thought out. I love the ergonomics of it. I want to use this abstraction. It hasn't hurt me by thinking of code this way. And if you can design something that meets those criteria, will I ever? I have no idea, right? But can I aspire to doing this? And I think this is kind of like IKEA bookshelf, which is super pragmatic and great and cheap, and you're just gonna get it done. Versus like you go down some YouTube rabbit hole and there's the person who's got like the perfect mitered edges and hand built every little thing, and it's like a bookshelf that you're shocked exists, and it's just a work of art. That's the type of code I would like to work on a long term. And so that's why I think one.
Absolutely, it's a great book. This is another one, sometimes in Reddit, in the software engineering threads or software engineering subreddits, threads will pop up with like, hey, what's a good software engineering book to read? Without fail, this is always one I recommend because again, it's a short read. It's got a lot of great concepts in there. I think it didn't crack my top 5 again because I've been a little more focused on being like a workhorse at work, just trying to get as much stuff done as I possibly can. I'm probably a little guilty these days of being a bit of the tactical tornado that John Osterhout talks about. But I'm just trying to always have a lot of stuff that needs to get done. And I also am a believer that there's not nearly as much of a trade-off between good code and fast code. And reading a philosophy of software design is the kind of thing that I think will help you write good code more quickly. And even, he has like kind of his design it twice approach, right? I think I'm fortunate that at the place I work and just the product we work on, we do have leeway to kind of like ship something and then come back to it later. And so I actually have been taking that design it twice approach, but not in the design stage. Like sometimes I'll ship a feature and then it'll go for a weekend. It's working, but then I'll have to come back to it, or I'll just be thinking about it. I'm just like, the way we're doing that is not great. And then I'll put in another pull request a week later. And so,
Right.
if I think that's very much John Osterhold's design it twice mentality. And it has, that book has given me kind of the courage to not just take any code I run across as like the gospel truth, right? Like I was mentioning, we're trying to move to like more of a config driven approach for our product. Previously, a bunch of stuff was just done via like environment variables. So we have like our configs, right? But then all of those config objects were defined in kind of like the server crate in Rust, which is like the thing that wires up all the other crates into the server. Unfortunately, the server crate depends on all the other sub crates. And so, but that's where the configs are defined, is in the server crate. But if in one of the sub crates you want to reference the config, right? Like let's say you want to pass the config in as a prop to one of the sub crates, you can't do that because now it's a circular dependency. So I was like, I got to move these configs into their own like config crate, and then everyone can just reference it. But I think that's kind of like the John Osterholt design it twice approach, where even though I didn't design the config way we were doing it the first time, I wonder if whoever had designed that the first time, if they had taken a step to think of it the John Osterholt way and be like, okay, well now let me do another pass at this again, because it's like he said in our interview, like sometimes you don't even like iterate on the design, you just come up with a completely new design. And because you could imagine like, okay, I either have the configs all live in one place, or maybe I could scatter the configs and they all live next to the the service they actually configure. You might have looked at that and been like, well, actually, the second approach is a better idea, because now we don't have circular dependencies. Now, they can kind of know their object structure. I don't know. But all that to say, it's a good book.
No, it's true though, because like I'm in this really interesting place right now for me, is that I'm actually in a a software architect role. My expectation isn't to write these core implementations, right? Like we have phenomenal software engineers, right? If we can point in the right direction, my job has really been looking at the problem space that we're in and being like, are we headed the right direction, or is this meeting some philosophical underpinnings that we really need? And I'm working in blockchain, so we actually write smart contracts for some of our work, and smart contracts are this really weird thing where once you write the code, it's on the chain that you can't update the software. And so like you have to be very deliberate with how you're writing things for safety and other stuff. It also reminds me of one other thing, which is there's a couple of kitchen tools that I particularly love. And I think the kitchen's great because you have to work with these things all the time, right? So you can just use a traditional thing like a cutting board and knife. Those are two sort of abstractions that have been around a long time, right? One of my favorite ones is there's a garlic press that we use it's a curved piece of metal. So most of the time garlic press is this like 3-piece thing, and you have to squish the garlic in, and it's just a pain to clean out. It's nobody wants to clean the garlic press. Or you get some like fancy electronic one that's like super complicated, and you either have to like find the plug or find batteries. This is a curved piece of metal, and you literally use your body to rock over the garlic.
Oh, interesting.
It's amazing. And I'll tell you, there's no moving parts. You're the moving part. It's easy to clean. And I've probably had that tool in my kitchen for like at least 15 years, maybe even longer. And it's delightful. Like I'm talking about it right now. One other thing, and again, to me, I'm like, can I build a piece of software that's so intuitive and so simple that we're like, how did we not do that this way before, right? I feel like that's what like the Unix file system was, right? Multics came out, all these Multics stuff came out, and then Ken Thompson's like, what if everything's just a file and it's just bytes flowing in and out of stuff, and you're like, how did you think about this, right? Like that's so straightforward and simple. And so that's what I aspire to. I'm like, is there yes, there's a correct implementation, but can I find this like, Zen master way of saying like, that's the essence. Here's the simplicity. Like this is how we build a foundational piece here. And then you can build all the complexity on top of it. Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, this is something I've been learning, which is that there's no real one true way to build software, right? That was actually a big surprise to me moving from I worked at a big cloud provider before my current company. Now I work at kind of like a big e-commerce company. And I thought theoretically there'd be a lot of overlap between the two. But I wound up in the growth organization, which builds like internal tools, and my specialty is marketing to try to, get more people using the product. But our internal tools have like maybe 100 to 200 users. Now they're important tools because they govern a lot of spend, right? Like they govern how millions and millions of dollars are spent, marketing dollars, right? But at the cloud provider, right, like our system, we weren't building anything new. The system had been built years ago, and there was like it generated $1 billion a year, and our job was to keep it running and to make kind of incremental improvements on it. And so there wasn't really this culture of like, oh, I'll just grab some tickets from the backlog and I'll make myself useful and do this or that. We didn't have like small tickets. Like we had big initiatives, and you as an engineer would lead a single initiative, and that might span a long time, right? It was actually one of the lessons I learned there. I did this feature that basically let like our product, you could part of the product was it would provision like a network interface in your virtual private cloud, right? It would provision that with just a random IP address that fit within your subnet site or range, right? Users wanted to be able to provide their own IP addresses usually for firewall rules. And so I was in charge of getting that done. And that was a cool feature because it was public facing. Like it was announced on the company blog when it got done. No one else on my team really got to do anything like that. And it made changes to the provider's console UI, which no one else really did. So I had to do the full thing. I had to do security review, operational review. I had to work with the front end team. I had to work with legal. I had to work with the documentation writers, everything, right? And it took a long time. It took like 6 months to get it done from start to finish. And we were proud when it was done. But I remember my boss telling me, just saying like, Carter, if I'd known it would take this long, I never would have done it. And I felt the same way too. I was like, this was way too much red tape for such a small feature. I'm like, if we do this again in the future, we need to be bundling features up so that, legal reviews 3 features at a time, right? And we can kind of just consolidate it. And so I really learned at that company, like, hey, you got to know if the juice is worth the squeeze. Mm-hmm. At our current company, we can just try stuff. Like I was joking the other day, like we had said, like we were talking about our UI we had built and kind of the things that were wrong with it. And someone asked, like, do we get feedback on the UI? And someone's like, no, not really. Someone's like, why not? Someone's like, I don't think people realize they can give feedback on the UI. I was like, what if we just put like a provide feedback button up in the header, right? And then that just links out to a Google form. And like, see if anyone uses it, that's great. And if not, we'll get rid of it in a few months. If you're like, okay, yeah, let's do it. It's 15 minutes of work to get that up and working. Not kidding. At the cloud provider, that would have been about a 2-month effort. Wow. And so like before, like I had to train myself out of that mindset of like, I've got to have it be perfect. I've got to really, really understand what I'm doing before I do it. And I'm now just trying to try a lot more things. And so I think a philosophy of software design approach is really valuable if you're at somewhere like you're talking about, where like you say it winds up in the blockchain. Once it's there, right? If you're at a big cloud provider and if you release this feature, you have to support it until the day the service dies. So you better build it right the first time. But if you're at somewhere a little more startup-y, or maybe you're working on internal tooling and you have the ability to like, you need to operate in kind of a different way, and you just need to be trying lots and lots more stuff. And it's actually, it's like the Unicorn Project, like they do, where they have this group at the end where they're just trying lots of new initiatives. They know that a lot of them aren't going to work out, and that's fine, right? Yep. Like you have 90% of your shots fail and only 10% succeed. That's fine if you're taking lots and lots and lots of shots, right?
And I will say, this is really important. Perfect is the enemy of good. You really can get into this analysis paralysis piece, and you really can get into a spot where like, oh, I haven't shipped because I'm still pontificating, right? I'm still going off and coming up with the most perfect design ever. And that really is, this is why I actually think that John Osterhout and Uncle Bob or Martin Fowler or any of the folks that are in the Agile side, they're both correct for the type of problem you're trying to solve. Right?
Yeah.
You really can't iterate on, the TCP protocol. Like you really have to kind of nail it the first time. Otherwise, you run into all kinds of problems, and then people end up trying to replace protocols, and it's hard. But if you're trying to ship value for a business, you need to ship good value on a regular cadence, right? Like that is a different type of software development, and neither one's better than the other. Your business doesn't need a perfect protocol implementation for something, probably, unless you're a protocol business. But you know, I will say the empathy that I've gotten from these pragmatic books and these ivory tower books is they're both correct within their worldview, and they're both tools that you may want to use, right? I'll get back to this other thing. Like, if I'm going to give someone a wedding gift, right, I might want to sit down and make that handmade, jewelry box or something where every little detail is like down to the, like, oh, how did they do this? Well, this is a thing of beauty. Or I'm just like, my room's a mess. I need a box to put junk in, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't make the perfect jewelry box and let it block cleaning up your room, which that's the goal, right? Like, oh, I have this beautiful jewelry box. 6 months later, why isn't your room clean? Well, I had to make the jewelry box first. Like, no, don't do that. Please don't do that. Just clean your room.
I've often said that I think for people outside this industry looking in, one of the biggest misconceptions one might have about this industry, this industry is more art than science at a lot of points. There's a lot of, like, good judgment goes a long way in this industry, and I think people kind of think like it's code. Like, what is more robotic and calculating and cold than code? But it's you really have to know what environment you're operating in. What are the trade-offs? And that's another great thing you learn from like fundamentals of software architecture. It's like everything is just trade-offs. And so I can't recommend like what is the best way to write your code, or to be a software engineer. And for what it's worth, I actually think that's something that's a bit of a poison you get from working at like a FANG, because you're like, I'm at a FANG. These guys have cracked software engineering. Like, this is the one true way to be a software engineer. And then you go to somewhere with a completely different context around it, and you realize, wait a minute, the FANG way makes a lot of sense if you're governing a product that generates $1 billion and could conceivably affect 1 billion users, but it's totally not the right fit if you're doing something different, right? So I just encourage anyone, no matter where you're at in your career, right? Like, just because you have a way that maybe works out really well for you doesn't necessarily mean that's the best way to operate in every single environment.
Right.
Well, I'll share my number one then.
Yes.
And this one surprised even me. Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. Yeah.
I had a feeling that maybe this was your number one. Yes.
Yeah.
This almost made my top list as well. And I'm excited to hear. I want to hear why.
Absolutely. Right. So I had mentioned on the podcast, right, that this, I was a little skeptical of this book going in, right? I am a big, I live in Utah. Our state motto is industry, right? Like I've gotten far in my life by kind of just continually hustling. And so here, reading this book and being a little like, when are you talking about to slow down? Are you kidding me? No, I really enjoyed it, and I've only enjoyed it more as time has gone on. And I think just for me, realizing in my life that I need to scope things down, and that I need to focus on what is really most important in my life. He talks about having like a couple missions, right? And then I've been able lately to give myself permission to rest. I was kind of like, I have to fill every single hour of my day with what he calls pseudo productivity. And that's really what I was doing.
Right.
And instead realizing, no, I need to focus on what's most important. And then when I'm not doing that, I need to be legitimately resting in a restorative way. I just had the Thanksgiving weekend, and I think before that would have been really nerve-wracking to me, because like I spent a lot of this weekend doing nothing in particular, right? And before, I would think like, oh gosh, like you only have so much time here on Earth. Why aren't you working? Why aren't you doing more? And I've instead been able to tell myself like, no, you are doing something right now. You're resting, because you have a lot of work waiting for you on Monday with work and with the podcast and with school or whatever, right? Like, I'd say like those are kind of my top three missions. Family is always an ever-present mission, right? And I'm like, and you need to be able to devote your time and energies to, right now, I consider my most important mission, my day job. I'm like, you need to be able to devote all your time and energy to that. So I think just that like overarching lesson has really resonated with me. I think this is the book that has probably changed how I operate on a day-to-day basis the most out of anything we've read. And I also do appreciate some of the more specific suggestions. We talked about like even like redecorating seasonally. Like I think that's an interesting idea. Something I want to do. He talks about like becoming a cinephile. I just haven't quite had the time for it yet, but especially when I finish school, like I think that's something I'm going to do. Like I've always enjoyed Steven Spielberg's work, but I've never like comprehensively watched his entire filmography. That's something I'd love to do, is just watch every Steven Spielberg film. And really, like my wife makes fun of me when we watch like a movie, especially if we rewatch a TV show, like we just rewatched Severance. I will pause it every 5 minutes to talk about something in the show. Like I'm a very active consumer of media. Like I'll often like tell my wife, like I'm like, we can't be on our phones during this. Like it's a visual medium. We have to appreciate what they're showing us on the screen. And so I like how we tied that to kind of like, this can help kind of generate creative juices, and that'll make you more productive in the important parts of your job. And it's helped me at my job. Like to really think instead, like, okay, what actually delivers value for the business, right? Like there's a lot of pseudo productive stuff I could do. What's actually important? And then being able to focus on that. So yeah, I think this really changed how I think a lot about how do I relax? How do I work? And yeah, it just had the biggest impact on me. So for me, that's why it clinched number one.
That's amazing. It was on my top 5 list until the very end when I did a little bit of refactoring. I loved this book. And again, that's one of those where, like, depending on the time of day or the time of the week, it easily could have been on my top 5. It wasn't in position 1. And that's interesting to think about, just because like I'm a big fan of Cal Newport in general. And I think maybe that's where it was. Like I read a lot of self-help, like a ridiculous amount. And I think maybe I had kind of like filed that away into like that part of my world, instead of thinking about it from a Book Overflow standpoint, because it was one of my favorite books just in general. So I completely understand why that made number 1. It also has had an impact on me in a very positive way. When I was reading it, I think I need to reread it and like reapply some of the principles, because I think that was one of the things that some of these books immediately turned into value that came out of it. And then some of these have been sort of like, I guess, something that I've let kind of slow burn. But you're right. It's a fantastic number 1. I endorse your number 1. I think that's great.
This is one where, like, let's say this podcast went on for like 5 years, right? And if we did like a top 5 for every single book we've ever read, like I wouldn't be surprised if this is one that has a lot of enduring value.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is another, and it's another one. Like I feel bad realizing like, what do all of mine have in common? They were short, right? Like, but this is a good one. This is one you could read in like a week or 2.
Yeah, that is
fundamental software architecture isn't that's a we did 2. We actually did 2 episodes for my top 3. We did Sober Activity, Fundamental Software Architecture, and Web Scalability for Startup Engineers. Those are all 2-parters, so I guess they're not all too short.
Mark Twain, I think, at least it's apocryphal. I'm not sure if it's true, but he said, I didn't have time to write a shorter letter. Right. Yeah. So like, I do think that I appreciate people who can hone their thoughts into shorter form, and so, because it sounds hilarious until you start writing or doing these other things. You're like, it's hard to edit. It's hard to get an idea down to a shorter form if you have something significant to say. And and so I think maybe you also just intuitively appreciate those that have like, said something profound in fewer words.
I think this might also be apocryphal. I think it might just be a quote from Abraham Lincoln from the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, a great movie. But I could write shorter sermons, but when I get started, I'm too lazy to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so it's no, that's really cool. Well, This was awesome. What a cool way to end the year. Is this our last episode? Or
we have one more episode.
Okay.
So our final episode, this will be a way to celebrate all of the books we have read, not just our top 5. So we've kind of purposely saved this one for the end after we did our accountability check and after we did our top 5, just to kind of prime the audience to remember all of the books we've read. This last episode is going to be a game. I won't reveal quite what it is yet.
Oh yeah. This will be fun.
And no spoilers, but there is a way for you, the listener, to play the game. So we are excited to share this. We've been working on this for a little bit. That's how we're going to end the year. We'll go dark for about 2 weeks after that, and then we'll be back with finally giving Georges Oras his due and reading his book, the Software Engineer's Guide book. Again, that is my fault. I've been so busy we had to kind of kick that one out to the new year. But yeah, we're really excited about this game we have. And again, something that you two can experience. And yeah, this was a lot of fun just talking about our favorite books. I mean, there's so much to learn in this field, and it's really cool realize, like, I think that's been my biggest surprise with the podcast, is just realizing like how much knowledge is kind of like freely available, or if not free, then like I think the most expensive book on this list is like $30. Well worth the price. And then for us personally, really cool to be able to talk to so many of these authors. So yeah, I think we've really enjoyed the podcast. If you're here listening, we hope that you've enjoyed it too. And yeah, I mean, any closing thoughts on this first year of Book Overflow, Nathan?
This was cool. It's exceeded my expectations. I really love our growing audience. Please, like, subscribe, and comment. We really get a kick out of getting your feedback. So
yes.
That helps us. You can have an impact, right? Our audience is small enough right now. We're over 5,000, but it's small enough that we will actually read all the comments. So that may not be true forever. And so if you want to have an impact on us, speak up. Tell us what you like and what you don't like. That'd
absolutely.
Be really cool.
And you can always leave those comments on YouTube. You can leave them on Spotify. You can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. And you can find all of Nathan's work with Functionally Imperative at www.functionallyimperative.com. And you can find all of our extra material. I don't know. Yeah, our website is www.bookoverflow.io. It's mostly a landing page, but our reading schedule is also up there. It might be slightly out of date. I'll check that right now. Anyhow, thanks everyone for tuning in. Like I said, we're really excited with the episode we have for you next week. Should be a fun one. And thank you so much for just being along with us for this ride. We're excited. We only had 15 books this year, but our top 5 next year should be much more competitive, because I imagine we'll have around 30 books. Yeah, that's it for us this week. We'll see you around, folks.
See ya.